Morning, good evening. On behalf of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, I would like to welcome you all to this expert discussion on building forward fairer economic policies for an inclusive recovery and development. My name is Kaveh Zahidi. I'm the deputy at ESCAP and have the honor of moderating this session. The three-day event that this session is a part of is bringing together really an extraordinary array of experts, government, central bank officials, development partners, all to unpack a little bit what is needed for inclusive recovery and development in the Asia-Pacific region. And to kickstart it all, we are really absolutely thrilled and honored to have Baroness Minouche Shafik as our opening keynote speaker. For most of us, of course, Baroness Minouche Shafik needs no introduction. She is currently the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science and a leading economist whose career has straddled both public policy and academia. A graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst with a master's from LSE and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. Minouche has also taught at Georgetown University and Wharton Business School. Now, in terms of a professional career, as well as being I believe, the youngest vice president of the World Bank, she has also held numerous high-level positions, including permanent secretary of the Department for International Development of the United Kingdom, the deputy managing director of the IMF, and deputy governor of the Bank of England. Minouche has also, of course, published extremely widely, with her newest book being titled What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. And the book explores issues that are absolutely at the heart of our meeting over these 3 days. And that is basically making economies inclusive. Now, at its core, her book, I believe, contends that ensuring equality of opportunity is it's not just a question of fairness, but it's something that makes economic sense. So Minouche, we look forward to your insights on what is needed to build a fairer economy and society, especially now as countries try to rebound from the COVID pandemic, a pandemic which of course is far from over. So without any further ado, if I could just ask colleagues on the line to please mute your microphones, and with that, I will give the floor to Baroness Minouche Shafik. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kaveh, for that kind introduction, and it's really an honor to be invited to give this talk, and my only regret is that I'm not in Bangkok with you. Thank you again, and it's really also a real pleasure for me to speak to an organization whose mission and people I very much admire. As you said, I spent most of my professional life with some of the great multilateral institutions in the world, and more than anything else, that the world needs that spirit of international cooperation and collaboration embodied in the work that all of you do. So let me just start by saying a few words about the context in the Asia-Pacific region. Virtually every observer from the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN has concluded that the pandemic has only exacerbated pervasive inequalities across the Asia-Pacific region. And this includes disparities between countries, where China and India's relatively quick return to growth overshadows many other countries in Central and Southeast Asia, and particularly the devastated economies of the Pacific countries who've been dependent on tourism. It includes also disparities between the genders, as Asia's women's workforce participation has taken much longer to return to 2019 levels, and further complicated by a dramatic increase in unpaid care and work and domestic violence. And it includes, of course, disparities between the generations, with more than 400 million children in South Asia having to shift to remote learning without reliable internet access, permanently disrupting the most valuable years of an entire cohort's already limited access to good quality education. So I'm aware that I'm preaching to the choir. I'm telling you things you already know. And indeed, your own economic and social survey last year estimated that some 89 million people will fall back into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And those are lost gains that cannot be won back easily due to the threshold effects of poverty. And of course, the pandemic, as you noted, is far from over in developing Asia, with a lack of vaccines, a new variant to contend with, fragile healthcare infrastructure, and closed borders continuing to strangle the social and economic life of billions of people. So how states respond to these intersecting challenges will determine the outcome of what only 2 years ago was christened the Asian century. Now, there's much talk of building back better, building back fairer, but what does that actually mean? I think the UN Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda, provides a way forward, and it resonates a great deal with my recent book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. Not surprisingly, since I spoke a great deal with his team when they were preparing that report. And I think what it highlights is that it's a timely moment to rethink the norms, rules, and obligations that bind individuals, companies, and states together, and redefine what we owe each other, what I call the social contract. What do I actually mean by that? Let me run through what I mean by the social contract, why I think it's broken, and what I think a better one would look like. So what do I mean by the new social contract? I think it goes to questions like, for example, what are children raised at home by mothers or grandparents, or does the state provide childcare centers or paid parental leave so that both parents can care for children? How much of healthcare is the responsibility of individuals, and how much do we pay for collectively through insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits such as sick leave and pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry the risks of illness and old age? In more traditional societies, what we owe each other tends to be delivered by families and communities. In more modern societies, the market and the state play a greater role. But in all societies, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they're adults in exchange for being looked after when they're young or old or unable to support themselves. So why do I think the social contract is broken? Well, until the late 20th century, social contracts were premised on the idea that families would have a sole male breadwinner and that women would take care of the young and the old. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children in marriage. They would have steady employment with a handful of employers over a career. I think I'm not ready for that slide quite yet. Yeah, thank you very much. And they would have very few employers, and the skills that they accumulated in school would be enough to last for their careers. And most people would only have a limited number of years after retirement, and the support that they needed in old age would be provided by their families. Now, those assumptions which underpin our current social contract are increasingly irrelevant to our societies. Today, more than half of women are employed in the labor market globally, and the upward trend is universal. In advanced economies, between a third and a half of marriages end in divorce, and the rates of divorce in the developing world are going up. A growing proportion of children are being born outside of marriage or being raised outside of marriage. The average worker has many more jobs over the course of a lifetime, and technology is only increasing that over time. And while many developing countries are transitioning to get more workers employed in the formal sector, there are growing signs of informality in the labor market in both advanced countries. And of course, climate change brings on a whole new set of risks that would disrupt our economies and our sustainability. I think the big disruptors of the social contract thus far have been the changing role of women, which affected childcare and elderly care, and technology, which had changed what we need from our educational systems. Looking forward, I think there are more challenges to the social contract from aging and climate change. So let me say something about what the difference between the social contract is and the welfare state, just to clarify that. And I'll take that for the next slide now. Yeah, there we go. So the social contract reflects all the ways that we organize things that we want to deliver collectively through families, communities, employers, and the state. And the welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering those common goods. There's often a misconception that the welfare state is primarily about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, what is often called the Robin Hood function. But the main purpose of the welfare state is actually to redistribute income over our own lives, what's sometimes called the piggy bank function. A clever child, for example, can't go to a bank and say, I'd like to take a loan for my education and I'll pay you back when I get a good job. That is the role of the state, to manage that intertemporal income over time. This chart here shows you what the age profile of the relationship between an individual and the state is in using UK data. And what it shows is that in the middle of life, roughly from your 20s to your 60s, most people are net contributors to the state. That's that big hump in the middle. And in contrast, when people are very young and are very old, they benefit from the state in the early years through education spending, and in the later years through health and welfare spending. And that intertemporal role of the welfare state is incredibly important, and the most important thing that the state does. It invests in us when we're young, asks us to contribute to investing in others when we're middle-aged, and then everyone else contributes to looking after us when we're old. And so that one has to hold that idea in one's mind in thinking about the role of the state. Now let me give you some examples of why I think the current social contract is broken and what a better one would look like. And I'll start with education. The next slide shows you what we have done in terms of investing in education in recent years. And well, I should start by acknowledging that we have made huge progress in terms of getting children into primary and secondary school, and probably nowhere more than in the Asia region, where there's been a massive increase in enrollment fueled by public investment. But what's interesting is that almost all of our investment in education is highly focused on primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, between roughly the ages of 5 or 6 to people's early 20s. Spending on pre-primary and adult learning is very modest in relative terms, as you can see from this chart. And yet we still continue to have huge inequalities in our society, and education hasn't done enough to close those gaps. And I think the forces of technology and aging will mean that people will work for much longer and have to change jobs more often. Now, what does that mean for our educational systems? If you look at research from places as different as Jamaica and Chicago, what it shows is that providing extra nutrition to preschool children and supporting parenting skills in those early years has huge consequences for educational outcomes and higher incomes later in life. As an example that I often cite from Jamaica, children who had a visit once a week by a social worker who supported those families in terms of nutrition and mental stimulation of very young children before the age of 3, those children who had that weekly visit earned 42% more than children who didn't have that visit as adults. And hundreds of studies of adult learning have demonstrated how it's possible with strong links between employers, early intervention, and sustained funding to support people to be successful in adult learning later in life. And so I would argue that our educational systems now need to change to invest more in the early years, where the returns are very high and where you can have the biggest impact on social mobility and equality, and also to invest more in the later years, where the fact that people will have longer careers and have to cope with many technological changes mean that reskilling throughout life is important. And a better social contract would change the shape of our educational system. Let me give you an example from the labor market and employment. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is that informality, something that in my career one used to associate with very poor countries, has become a feature everywhere. More workers in advanced economies as well are on flexible contracts, and that means they work often for many employers, even in the course of just a week. And that flexibility has had benefits for employers and for consumers who benefit from lower cost services and goods. But for those employed on those flexible contracts, who arguably may have jobs they wouldn't have had otherwise, but they also have to deal with a great deal of insecurity about their incomes, their hours of work, and what happens when they're sick or old. I would argue that a better social contract would retain the benefits of flexibility while providing workers more security in the form of mandatory benefits for all workers and generous unemployment insurance and opportunities for retraining. The next chart shows how different countries have dealt with this challenge in different ways. You'll see that many advanced economies are in the upper left-hand quadrant, where you have rigid labor markets and very high levels of employment protection. Many developing countries have dual labor markets, where you have high protection and low flexibility for those very small numbers employed in the formal sector, while most workers in the informal economy are highly insecure. I think the sweet spot is countries like Denmark and New Zealand, where employers have flexibility, but workers also have very high levels of protection. In those economies, the social contract protects the worker rather than the job. In fact, if you look at many Nordic countries, they have the highest rates of labor turnover in Europe, with workers not necessarily even getting notice periods or severance pay, but they get very generous unemployment insurance and retraining and tend to very quickly be reemployed. I think we need to move toward a system which is often called flexicurity, which mandates benefits for all workers regardless of their employment contract. And just as workers increasingly have portable pension pots that they can move from one employer to the next, they also need portable benefit pots for their sick leave and holiday pay and health insurance and training allowances that all the employers that they work with throughout their lives contribute to. Finally, let me just give you an example about the intergenerational social contract. I think in every society, every generation wants to leave the next one better off. And yet we're at risk of leaving future generations with much poorer prospects for their livelihoods, a legacy of debt, and a severely damaged planet. The next slide shows how different expectations are between advanced and developing countries. What's really striking is that in all the advanced economies, people think their children will be worse off than them. It's not true for the developing world, where people still have hope that their children will be better off. But the pandemic, of course, has disrupted the education of millions of children around the world and resulted in the accumulation of debts never before seen in human history. And there is no doubt that the next generation will inherit a planet with far less biodiversity and be much hotter and carry more environmental risks than previous generations. So the question is, how can we put the intergenerational social contract right? I would argue that we need to invest in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be much longer working lives. The resulting gains in productivity would help pay for the elderly care needs of an aging population and make debt more sustainable in the future. I think in the book I argue that we should give young people an educational endowment for life so they can adapt to changes in work. And everyone should have better access to better reskilling opportunities so that they can contribute to society for longer. And we need to do as much as we can to redress the environmental damage and find ways to help reduce the fiscal burden on future generations. And to achieve that, today's older people will have to work longer. And I argue in the book, we need to link retirement ages explicitly to life expectancy. And we also need to look at carbon taxation. And I think that set of interventions would be an enlightened investment by one generation in the next as a basis for a new social contract. Now, I think there are a few principles that can guide what a better social contract should look like. The first is that there should be minimum security for all. I think in every society it is possible to put a floor on people's incomes below which no one should go. In many parts of the developing world, including many parts of the Asia region, cash transfer programs have been introduced to provide a floor on people's incomes. In other countries, tax credits for low-wage workers have been used. And that minimum should include access to basic health care and a minimum state pension to avoid destitution in old age. I am not a fan of universal basic income, and we can talk about that during the discussion, because I think it undermines the principles of the social contract, and I think it's very inefficient. I think there are better ways to target minimum security for all. The second principle is maximum investment in opportunity and capability. The next slide shows you what has happened to social mobility in different countries. And what it shows is how bleak social mobility is in many parts of the world. In countries like the UK and the US, it takes 5 generations to go from the lowest part of the income distribution to the middle. In Denmark, they achieve it in 2. In South Africa and Brazil, it takes 9 generations to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle. And what that tells us is that our societies are wasting talent and not providing opportunities to many people to improve their lot. Much of that wasted talent is embodied in women, minority groups, and children who happen to be born into poor families or into poor places where they don't get many chances. That is such a huge economic waste, and I think, as Kaveh said in the beginning, in the book I argue this isn't just unfair, it's inefficient. When you look at what happened in the United States between 1960 and 2010, a period of very high productivity, between 20 and 40% of that productivity improvement can be explained by the fact that rather than drawing on a narrow talent pool of white men, changes in laws and norms meant that employers drew on a much broader pool of skills, including women and Black people and minorities. And that meant that people got assigned to the jobs that suited them best, and that meant that everyone was more productive. So how can we use the talent in our societies better? I think in addition to investing in the early years, as I said before, we should also be giving young people an equal entitlement to education over their lifetime and enable them to reskill throughout life. And while most countries have equalized educational opportunities for girls and boys, we still have the issue that women still do about 2 hours more unpaid work around the world. So finding better solutions to more generous parental leave, public funding to support families, and a fairer division of labor at home would mean that female talent is better used in our societies. So the third principle for my better social contract is that we need to share risks better. I think too many risks in our societies are being borne by individuals when they could be more efficiently borne by others or managed collectively. For example, it's possible to maintain flexibility for employers and still be able to hire and fire workers depending on market conditions if those workers know that they will be looked after if they're unemployed and need reskilling. We need a similar rebalancing of risks around childcare, health, and old age. For example, why is the cost of maternity leave borne by employers when parental leave paid for through general taxation would create a more level playing field in the labor market between men and women, and especially be fairer for smaller firms for whom it's an issue? Let me just touch on the question of, is this affordable? Some of the things I've mentioned, increased public support for childcare, early years education, and lifelong learning, would require more spending, as would achieving universal healthcare and a minimum state pension. Now, some of this spending would be investment and would generate higher future tax returns. So, for example, we know that public investments in education have a rate of return of roughly 10% globally. And some of them would generate returns if we measured things properly, such as investments in the environment. Those investments, because they're generating returns, can sensibly be financed through borrowing, especially at a time when interest rates are still relatively low. And some of the spending on pensions and elements of healthcare, for example, will be recurrent and needed to be financed from tax revenues. I think there's room in many countries to raise income taxes. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a fall in income tax rates and corporate tax rates around the world. I think there's also opportunities in some countries around wealth taxes and property taxes. And I would also support the introduction of a carbon tax. But I think what I would also say is that the new social contract that I've described is not just an opportunity to raise taxes and spend more. What I really emphasize is not redistributive policies, but what economists call pre-distribution policies, policies that equalize access to good education, provide additional investment in deprived communities, and empower individuals to take up opportunities. And those pre-distribution policies are a fundamental reordering of the opportunities that people have, and I would argue would increase productivity overall and ultimately result in higher income. So this isn't about higher taxes, more redistribution, and a bigger welfare state. It's a lot more fundamental than that. It's about reordering and equalizing the distribution of opportunities and security in our societies. And financing that would require reordering and rebalancing the relative taxation of capital, which I think we tax too little, relative to labor, which tends to be taxed too much, and introducing taxes on things we want less of, like carbon and smoking, and investing more in education and greening the economy. So to conclude, we owe each other more than our current social contracts can deliver. We need a bit less emphasis on me, a bit more on the benefits of we. And I would argue that a new social contract is possible that gives everyone a decent life, shares risks more humanely, and draws on everyone's talents. And those principles that I've described would provide the foundation for a society built on recognizing our interdependence, enabling everyone to fulfill their potential, and asking everyone to contribute as much as they can for the common good, as the Secretary General has laid out. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Minouche. You know, if we were in a room, we would have a standing ovation now. That was really an incredibly rich introduction into this issue of essentially what is a reset of economies, of opportunities, and nowhere is it more needed than in our region of Asia Pacific. Allow me then, if you would, we are going to have come back to you, Minouche, with questions. There's so much we'd like to explore with you, and we would welcome questions in the chat box from the audience too. But first of all, allow me to introduce and turn the floor to our next speaker, Ms. Armida Salcia Alisjabana, who is the Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of UN ESCAP, and also my boss. So Ibu Armida was formerly Professor of Economics at Universitas Padjadjaran in Indonesia, where she also served as a Director for the Center for Sustainable Development Goals Studies, as well as being a chair of the Indonesian, Vice Chair of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences. Prior to that, Ibu Armida was the Minister of National Development Planning and the head of the National Development Planning Agency in Indonesia, along with being an alternative governor of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank representing Indonesia. Ibu Armida, I'm sure like all of us, you have an enormous amount you would like to react to from that keynote. But without, again, further ado, allow me to turn the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Cafe. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all colleagues, and especially to, if I may, Professor Shafiq Minouche. So I a little bit came a bit late because I had prior engagement, but I definitely followed your last segments of your presentation, and I took special notes. So basically, you already set out, yeah. Basically, set the stage for the follow-up series of conversation, with the exception of this morning session, which already started earlier. Again, if I may, yeah, rather than read my notes, I think I would like to reiterate 3 points, right? 3 points, especially this new social contract. Again, I'm sure Cafe already mentioned, yeah, at the start of the session, in which our Secretary General, in his report, Our Common Agenda, of 4 priority areas, right? A direction to the future. And one is this new social contract, of course, at the country level. Yeah, and one of the underpinning concern is actually this inequality, inclusiveness. And you hit rightly, directly on that point, in which what is the direction for the new social contract to have a more inclusive society. So priority of investment in one generation to be able to have a better future for the next generation. So 3 priority areas again, or 3 principles. You said it as principles. First is the so-called minimum floor, yeah, of but you didn't like the basic income sort of, but basically the minimum floor, including social services. Second is maximum investment in opportunity and capabilities, and third is also the need to share risk better across the various the various dimension. I think it's already set, yeah. So the next conversation and discussion, I think would be along those lines. If I may, yeah, having had also previous experience, I was in the academics, right, and still on in the academics because I'm on leave temporarily with this ESCAP assignment. So it's one thing, and then I was minister of Indonesia, a big country, which definitely this is one of the headache, right? This inequality and so on. But if I may, yeah, from my end, yeah, this is a little bit. Apologize to colleagues, yeah, of ESCAP because they already prepared the nice note here. But basically, yeah, again to reiterate your points. This ownership to reorient is one thing. This is a big job, definitely a big challenge. But the pre-existing situation, right, especially on the ownership of capital, because this is the basis of all, yeah, the ownership of capital, natural capital, man-made capital, as well as the human capital. Some, for example, companies or even individuals in some countries, they can own, right, this natural capital for whatever reason, right, very unequally, a land, yeah, a concession to mining and so on and so forth. Likewise, man-made, yeah, they own, right. Already, right, the concentration. Likewise, human capital, you mentioned education and so on. Second is what I see also the challenge, yeah, the economic structure. If we talk about, okay, we need to also how to restructure or how to transform the economy, yeah, then we are talking about the economic structure because all this inequality also derives from that. But then again, how to do this? Yeah, many countries. What we are afraid of is many countries in our region, being middle income and emerging, and some of the middle income countries are. I'm afraid. Yeah, the concern is maybe they will be trapped in the so-called middle income trap. Yeah, so we can learn from Latin America. They were having this increase, yeah, income and all this in the back then 70, 80, but after that it's stagnant. Likewise, several countries in Asia Pacific, yeah, only very few, yeah, to be frankly speaking, that already successfully evade this so-called middle income trap. So I think this is a bigger question, yeah. But again, if I may put it on the table for colleagues for further deliberation and discussion, is basically one is this ownership of assets, yeah, several asset or capital, several segment, natural, man-made, human capital, and second is the economic structure. You just cannot evade. If you want to have a more equal society, then you need to deal with these two. Right, directly or indirectly. So that's it. I will stop here. And again, thank you very much. I enjoy very much your presentation, and hopefully we can have a vibrant discussion to follow. Over to you, Kavi.
Thank you very much, Ibu Hamid. And I think you've started off that conversation, Ibu. You've posed, a very challenging question, because this reset does also mean a reset in some areas where there are enormous vested interests. You mentioned the ownership of assets, and you mentioned economic structure, both of which within them have extraordinary sort of inertia for change built in almost. So maybe that's a good starting point, Minouche. I mean, of course, in theory, everybody wants to address the high levels of inequality that we have in our region. We also know that our region has extremely low levels of investment in social protection, even to begin with, right? Around, I don't know, less than 5% of GDP, whereas the global average is over 10% of GDP, and the OECD is well over 20%. So we're starting with a low base, and we're starting with high and growing inequality. So what is the trigger what are some of those triggers to change course, especially with those major barriers that Ibu mentioned of ownership of assets and economic structure standing to some degree in our way? Over to you. You're on mute.
Very important issues, and thank you for raising those questions. I mean, on the distribution of assets and wealth, that is a huge problem, and of course the distribution of assets is much more unequal than the distribution of incomes, and even a bigger problem. I think that on equalizing the endowment of human capital, I think that is less controversial. And investing in more human capital to equalize educational opportunities, for example, I think that's politically the easiest part. The harder part is the distribution of land, distribution of property, and financial assets. And in most countries, there is an attempt to tax wealth. And there are three ways that countries tax wealth. One is inheritance tax. It tends to be around transactions, wealth taxes, so inheritance taxes, dividend taxes, and then attempts to tax the stock of wealth, which is the hardest. It's easier to try and equalize wealth when it's transacted. So if someone sells a property, the state takes a bit of a tax when the transfer of the asset happens. Those are easier to do, and most countries don't do enough of that. The hardest part is to tax the stock of wealth, because that is a much bigger deal. I actually think that most countries could do much more on property and land taxes as a way to try and equalize. There's some more radical ideas out there, like Piketty's idea that all wealth is redistributed across the generations, and so that you basically tax 10% of the wealth every year, and then eventually all the wealth is eroded and passed on to new generations. I think that's politically very difficult. But I do think property taxes are an important way forward. On the issue of economic structure, I mean, I think I completely agree with the risks around the middle income trap. As everyone knows, the middle income trap is the problem that when you move from low to middle income, it's relatively easy to do because you can adopt existing technologies and you move to the technological frontier, and then you very quickly can get yourself to middle income. But to go from middle to high income, you have to be inventive. You have to develop new technologies and new innovations that raise incomes. And you're quite right. There are a few countries in Asia that have made that transition. Korea is an obvious one. And they did that how? With big investments in education and big investments in research and development. So Korea has some of the highest rates of spending on R&D, both in the private sector and the public sector. And I think that's the key. And in many ways, what I've described as a better social contract is the underpinnings for avoiding the middle income trap, which is investing in the capabilities of everyone in society. So you accelerate the process of innovation and advancing in the technological frontier. But without that, I agree, you will be stuck in the middle income trap. That is the Latin America story.
Thank you very much, and I think you've triggered, of course, an avalanche of further questions with with that. I think one thing that I noted down while you were speaking, and also one of our guests has picked up, is this notion of flexicurity. It's an intriguing notion, and our guest says that yes, how can this really be fostered when again in several countries there's a benefit from having that informal sector. There is a benefit to the informality. Is this a disincentive, or is that too pessimistic? So maybe that's one area we could dive into.
Yeah. So flexicurity is actually not that common around the world. It's a model that really prevails in the Nordic countries in Northern Europe and a handful of other places around the world. But I think that the way they have made it work is to have a really clear partnership between government, employers, and trade unions. And there is a regular discussion between those parties to the benefit of the collective. So I'll just give some examples. So when you have a period of economic crisis, as part of those discussions, the unions will agree to wage restraint, knowing that when things are better, they will be compensated. And that intertemporal political trade-off is a key part of making that system work. Those institutions have evolved over decades, and many countries do not have, frankly, very good fora for discussion between unions, employers, and governments. I do think, though, that the digital economy provides us with some interesting options. For example, the notion of, governments can mandate that all workers have to get benefits and all employers have to pay them. But now that we have digital alternatives, the idea that every employee, let's just say, has a digital wallet where every employer they work for makes a small contribution to their sick pay or their holiday entitlement or to their health insurance. That's possible now in a much more flexible labor market in a way that it wasn't possible 20 years ago. And I think many countries are now moving very quickly on digitalization of financial services. And there is a possibility to do it in a decentralized way, unlike the way that the Nordics have done it, which is a fairly centralized approach toward tripartite relations in the labor market. So I think that is worth exploring. And I think, if you look at India and what India has done with the universal ID that everyone has, that's now enabled everyone to get a bank account. It's also been the vehicle for government to pay social benefits. And that's been very, very effective to be able to transfer, minimum cash transfers to poor households in India through that system. So I think that innovation creates an opportunity to implement flexicurity even in low-income countries without strong tripartite relations.
And I guess central to what you mentioned, this partnership that you mentioned is the issue of trust, which to some degree has been built, over generations. And this was another one of our questions. At the heart of the social contract is to some degree the necessity for this trust. And another one of our guests says that trust, even it was at low levels, and the past 2 years have even eroded it further with COVID-19. With that trust between people and states, international institutions. Even how do we address to some degree that trust deficit, which is the foundation of the common agenda? And I think the UN Secretary General, as Ibu Hamida mentioned, also mentioned trust in his report as a central feature.
Yes. I mean, I do agree that we are at a low point in trust. And if you look at there's something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys people around the world in about 20 or 30 countries. And you can see that levels of trust are very low in government, in corporations, in NGOs, in social media. It's interesting, though, where trust has gone up. Trust in experts has gone up, and scientists, I think partly because of COVID. Trust in mainstream media has improved while social media has fallen. And so I think the pandemic has changed the trust map in many countries of who people are willing to trust. I would like to think that the pandemic has also made people aware of how interdependent we are. I think let's face it, most countries in the world and even within countries have tried to manage the pandemic in a very individualistic way. And that hasn't worked very well. And countries that have done a better job of taking a collective approach to solving the pandemic have done better. And I'm hoping that that will change the way we think about politics and change the way we think about our interdependence. And also encourage people to think differently about who we should trust and how much we need each other to thrive.
Yes, I mean it can go either way. It could go either way.
Exactly.
So this maybe brings us to another issue. I mean, you did address the issue of fiscal space. I mean, it comes back again and again. Whenever there is a talk of a social contract, in greater investment in social protection, in education, all of the things that many of the things that you mentioned, we do get the automatic reaction that we just don't have the money. Where on earth do we get the money? We don't have the fiscal space. Now, to some degree, that was blown out of the water because suddenly that fiscal space opened up after COVID and billions appeared where they were impossible before. They did come with debt. We recognize that, and that debt has now maybe constrained the fiscal space further. So, how do we sort of get out of that chicken and egg situation of simply not having the resources to even begin on this reset?
Yeah. Well, so you're quite right. COVID showed what the state could do. When you look at the G20 countries, the fiscal response to the pandemic was roughly about 20% of GDP. That is 3 times what was spent during the 2008 financial crisis. It's 30 times more than what was spent during the Marshall Plan. The scale of the fiscal response was unprecedented. Of course, for low-income countries, it was a very different story. Most of them could only afford a few percentage points of GDP to respond to the pandemic. And that is part of another dimension of the inequality problem. But of course, we have ended up with, post-World War II levels of debt in many parts of the world. And of course, the question is, what do we do with that? And how do we get out? So if you look historically, how do countries deal with these big debt burdens? There are 3 ways you can deal with a debt burden. You can use inflation, you can use financial repression, or you can use growth. And in most historical episodes of debt, countries have used some combination of all 3 of those to reduce their debt levels. Now, the best way to get out of debt is growth. I remember when I was at the IMF and we spent a lot of time looking at debt sustainability of different countries, a half percentage point, 0.5% increase in growth would dramatically change the debt sustainability of a country because of the power of compounding. So I would argue that a new social contract would actually increase growth rates because you're investing in increases in productivity over the medium term. The key, of course, is that you have to spend the money well and spend it on things that really deliver that productivity and growth and take a long-term view. Education, research and development, smart levels of infrastructure in areas that really need it, that will deliver, that will crowd in private investment and productivity gains. I think we're also still at a period of relatively low interest rates in most countries. And so this is the moment for investment rather than austerity. I think that window will be finite and we should use it really well. But I think I would argue that that would be the response to that. I think the alternative of let's have, we accumulated this debt during the pandemic, let's have austerity for the next decade to repay the debt. That is a path to low growth, more inequality, and social conflict.
So picking up on that, and again, visiting then the issue of growth. I mean, high growth is one approach, and it's the approach that this region has essentially taken over the past few decades with some pretty impressive results, but not all around, and certainly not when it comes to the environment. And here, you know, we have, again, one of our colleagues is saying, well, you know, is there a sort of, you know, we live on a finite planet. How can this reset be done in a way that addresses that? I think you mentioned it as part of the sharing the risks better, right? You mentioned that climate has to be quite central to that, and you mentioned carbon tax. I guess the question is that enough? Because that's essentially accommodating the environment within the current economic models, rather than resetting to take into account a finite planet. And you know, there's many discussions out there whether it should be degrowth, whether it's about carbon space. But how does you know the new social contract help us to do also maybe the economic reset that takes into account a finite planet?
Yeah. So I'm not an advocate of degrowth or zero growth. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is a very different kind of growth. You know, if you look at the Asia region, it's a great example. Over the next 10 to 20 years, Asian governments will invest trillions in transforming the infrastructure of that region, in roads, power, cities, water supply, and so on. The way those investments are made will determine whether Asia's future is greener or not. Green or brown, basically. That's the choice. And if those investments in energy supply are in renewables, if those investments in transport focus on public transport and more sustainable methods of mobility, that will mean a very different future. And so those investments are the key. And for me, I think that, you know, making those investments will deliver growth, and, you know, borrowing legitimately for improving transport systems and infrastructure systems across Asia to make those investments greener will be vital. And also, you know, demanding payments for the environmental services that many countries in Asia provide to the world. You know, I'm thinking particularly of countries like Indonesia, but also many others. And I think over the next few years, I think we will see a transformation in the payments that those countries get for delivering environmental services. So I think that carbon tax is part of the story, because that really radically changes the incentives that everyone faces, both as consumers and investors. But you need much more in terms of investment, both in technology and in infrastructure, that create a different kind of growth going forward. And my colleague Nick Stern has written extensively on what that could look like in terms of a greener growth path and how that could be sustainable. Very much so, very much so. I know that we're coming to the end of our time. Let me just pose one more question that's come in from our audience, and that's I think it's related to some degree to wealth distribution. I won't say wealth redistribution, but wealth distribution, and it's it is somewhat related also to you know, how do you make it affordable to make the investments that you mentioned, and taxing is inevitably a part of that. I guess the question is, how do you make that happen when, you know, some of the biggest companies in the world are the tech companies, who seem to be accustomed to a very different different kind of taxing structure, or zero taxing, and have the flexibility to do so. You know, they become almost invisible. How do it's a very, very different globalized world that you're trying to deal with. And I know that there was, of course, the G8 movement on this, but could you maybe just as a last question address this issue of wealth distribution and taxation and how we can get that right? Yeah. So I think the OECD work on global corporate taxes was excellent. And the fact that the G7 and the G20 are on the cusp of putting that into place is very good news. Because if you look at what's happened to global corporate tax rate, well, to corporate tax rates around the world for the last 30 years, they have come down steadily in every country in the world, because everyone's competing with everyone else in a race to the bottom to attract investment. I think what what is being proposed, which is to have a floor on corporate taxes, is a good start. And I think the current floor is about 15%, but it means that every country in the world can get at least that much. I think the other really important innovation is the notion that part of the social contract is corporates pay tax where they operate, not behind some brass plate in an island in the Caribbean, where they have a nominal corporate jurisdictional presence. And so I think that change will also be a very important step. It's not enough, but it's a very good start. The other thing I'd say is that in many developing countries, if you look at tax rates in many developing countries, they look very similar to tax rates in many advanced economies, but their tax take tends to be much lower because evasion is high. And I think more work on tax administration and tax collection, and not necessarily having to raise rates, but just making sure that the taxes that are owed are actually collected is really important. And that's where I think the language of the social contract is very helpful. Having political leaders talk about taxes as, people paying back for what was invested in them and paying forward into the lives of their own children and grandchildren and the children and grandchildren of other people is why we pay taxes. In too many societies, people feel like I pay taxes so that they get stolen by the politicians. And in some cases, that's true. We need to change that. And we need to remind people that taxes underpin our social contract, and they underpin the mutual obligations that we have to each other. And it is more efficient to do some things collectively, and to do that, we all have to contribute. And to change the conversation about taxation, I think, is really, really important in order to get the kind of tax take we need to support a viable social contract.
Thank you so much, Minouche. We could go on for 10 hours, but I know our time is limited, and I know that you have other engagements. But as Ibu Amida said, honestly, each of the areas that you've identified for us as a basis for the social contract deserve their own conversation. Whether it's the minimum security for all, or the maximum investment in the social mobility, the shared risks, all of these pillars deserve much more. And we will be having part of that conversation, Minouche, at our next Commission session, which is really centered around what does the social contract mean in the Asia-Pacific context? What does the Secretary General's social contract really mean? What is its manifestation? And that's going to be as we celebrate our 75th year, which would seem to me a perfect time to advocate for the kind of reset that you have been speaking about today. Unfortunately, dear friends, we've run out of colleagues to pose any more of your questions, although we will try to answer some of those afterwards if we can. But that we just have enough time really for me to thank Baroness Minouche Shafik for joining us this early morning London time, and for a magnificent presentation. We're so grateful to you. Also to thank Ibu Amida for joining and steering and launching our conversation with some tough questions that I think we can unpack together through ESCAP in the coming weeks and months, as well as to MPFD colleagues, including Hamza and Shweta, who set up this lovely conversation, and to all of you for joining. So thank you again, Baroness Minouche Shafik, and to all of you, and I wish you a very good day.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Minouche.